Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with 16 of the greatest comic operas. Today, if you've been watching today's videos, this is, this is the year 2786. Of course, you don't know which day it is, but for those of you who are around on the day, lucky devils, this is sort of like comedy day, or this is the day when I rant and carry on about the humorless, miserable mass of classical music people who suck all the joy out of life and who crap on the idea of humor and who dislike the funniness that music can bring, and who think, of course, that music being high and elevated and culturally iconic and monumental can't be merely funny. Or somehow, if it is merely funny, it's lower than music which is somehow tragic. And I think it's just the opposite. I think the highest goal of music is music which is funny. I think it requires far more work, more musicianship, more talent than writing something. Tragedy, as I said in my previous talk, is so easy. You just find a minor key and hang and sit there. And the more minor it is, the more depressing and dismal it is, and the more tragic it is. And but really good, funny music. It's about timing. It's about contrast. It's about rhythm. It's about all of these musical qualities that you have to bring to bear in order to create music which can make people laugh, which is still actually an emotional reaction that's very poorly understood. So you can only imagine how much more poorly understood it is in musical terms, where you try to analyze things in terms of like harmonic process, which sometimes, there you go. So here are, without further ado, 16 unbelievably great comic operas. First, and we're starting at the beginning, Monteverdi's L'Incarnazione di Poppea. And as usual, the whole list is down below for your delectation. But what is the Coronation of Papaya? It's a comedy. It's a wonderful comedy. It's a celebration of the triumph of vice over virtue. And if that isn't funny, I don't know what is. It's about scheming Romans and Poppea's desire to get her son Nero coronated emperor and for her to become empress. And oh my goodness, they're all just killing each other and then plotting and scheming, and it's a riot. It's absolutely terrific. Now, of course, the characters take themselves perfectly seriously, but the comedy is, of course, is the moral inversion that the opera represents. And it's very, very interesting to look at commentary about this opera, where people talk about, well, the censors would never have permitted it, and how could they not depict the triumph of virtue? And well, everybody knew that in real life, these characters, after Poppea is triumphant, she gets murdered by her son, and everybody dies, and they all kill each other. So yes, vice is punished ultimately. It's all crap. People are people. People like a good laugh. People in those days liked a good laugh. Nobody, least of all the censors of the time, thought for 1 minute that anyone who saw this opera was not going to get it. So it has immoral characters in it. It depicts immorality. It's human. It's normal. That's what it is. And I love reading these analyses where they talk about how this fits into the moral aesthetics of the period and all that stuff. It's just a comic opera, period. And all the rest of it is just is intellectual masturbation, frankly, all the other discussion about it. So after Monteverdi, let's do a little chat about Handel's Partenope, however you want to pronounce it. This is an opera which I fascinated me. Absolutely fascinated me, reading these books on Handel operas and how people are trying to say it's not a comedy. This is an opera. Let's be clear here. This is an opera in which the climactic scene involves a guy who is pretending to be somebody else, and his girlfriend, who is dressed as a man, his ex-girlfriend, who is dressed as a man and is trying to get him back and humiliating, and has spent the whole opera trying to humiliate him because she knows who he really is, and in exchange for her not spilling the beans, she has the right to absolutely publicly destroy him at every point. And so it comes down to them having a duel, and as the dueler, he insists that they fight bare-chested. Well, this, of course, poses a problem for her. And so, the whole thing gets resolved in the end. And Partenope is actually the queen of someplace, and she's looking for a husband, and everybody's trying to marry her. And that's just a subplot, It's hilarious. It's an absolutely splendid comedy. And Winton Dean, who wrote, the books on Handel operas and all that, was trying so hard not to say it's just a comedy. It's a tragic opera, a serious opera with comic elements. It has a comic element. I mean, why? Why do they do this? Why are they trying so hard to denigrate the notion that a composer would use his highest and best talents, or hers, to write a comedy, to be funny? It's the mentality that freaks me out. It really is. I mean, do they think that the world isn't going to take them seriously enough? Why do they care? I mean, what sort of vile bourgeois moral... See how it, how I freak out about these things? It is what it is. It's funny. I'll leave it at that. Thank you, Handel. Next, Rameau's Platée. Yes. Now, nobody thinks Rameau is funny, and nobody thinks that French music generally is funny, least of all the French, who take it terribly, terribly seriously. Rameau, of course, was famous for being, the great French Baroque tragic composer, with his first tragedy, which he waited till he was 50 to write, Hippolyte et Aricie. And he wrote a lot of very tragic operas, but he did write some comedies too. And Rameau was just, a coloristic genius. His stuff is funny. His orchestration's wonderful. And Platée is a rather cruel comedy, actually. It's about an ugly nymph who thinks that Jupiter is in love with her. And that's the whole story. And, it's kind of like the third act of Der Rosenkavalier stretched out to a whole opera. In other words, the bumbling fool person who doesn't know that they're a bumbling fool is going to get tortured and relentlessly mocked and made fun of by everybody else. So by today's standards, the humor really is a little bit mean. It's a little nasty. Same thing with, Wagner and Beckmesser. It's not really funny because it's kind of mean, but what saves Rameau is, first of all, just the frothiness of the entire setting, and second of all, some really funny orchestration. I mean, when Platée is singing and all the frogs come and sing with her, and you really hear it. It's one of the first really telling examples of orchestral humor, or orchestral humor supporting the humor of the text. It's a wonderful piece. It's absolutely a wonderful piece. And if you don't know it, you really should get to know it. It was recorded on Errato. Whether it's still available, who knows? But it's a terrific little opera, ballet, opera, whatever it is. Those French Baroque things. They were combinations of singing and dancing and stuff. And they're wonderful. They're absolutely wonderful. And Platée is the great Rameauvian comedy. And after Rameau, these are three that you probably don't know that well. Here's one concession to the popular taste. The Marriage of Figaro by Mozart. I'm limiting myself, by the way, to one opera per composer. Some composers wrote multiple fabulous comedies, Mozart, of course, being the prime example. But The Marriage of Figaro was the first of the great Da Ponte operas, the first three that he wrote with Da Ponte, which has, comic opera, unlike tragic opera, really depends on the quality of the text. You've got to have a funny libretto to have really good, funny music. And so, as a general sort of quality issue, comic operas are really better than most tragic operas, because tragic operas can just wallow in bathos and nonsense. And as long as the music is dismal enough, it's going to be fine. And when the music is dismal, we tend to give it a lot more leeway for the words to be maudlin and stupid, and people don't care because the emotion is just so deep and profound, and we're just weeping, and no matter how silly the shit coming out of their mouth is, we tend to credit the tragedy. But in comedy, it doesn't work that way. If the story isn't funny, if the situations aren't funny, if the dialogue isn't funny, if the witticisms aren't in the text, then you're doomed. And so The Marriage of Figaro is such a critical work for that reason, because it's such a perfect marriage of text and music. A fabulous marriage of text and music, and I don't need to say anything more about it, because everybody who knew anything about an opera knew that this was like the greatest comic opera ever written at the time that it was written. And in a sense, so it remains. The others, Don Giovanni is much more complex. It's more nuanced in terms of its emotions. I mean, remember, the guy gets sucked down to hell, and there's murders and things going on. There are certainly lots of comic elements too, and the end is pure comedy. But it has its mix, which is, of course, why other people rate it more highly often than The Marriage of Figaro, because it's not just pure comedy. It's got other, And then there's Così fan tutti, which is so subtle, nobody knows anything about what's happening with anybody. I mean, it really is. It's very sophisticated. And for that reason, it's considered the most elevated, sometimes, of all of Mozart's comedies, although the 19th century considered it the most trivial, because it was dealing with bourgeois characters behaving badly, and it had no other lesson other than the fact that women were inconstant. Good for them. That's what I say. Go get them, and to hell with those Victorian schmoes. Funny is funny, and it's funny. And if Mozart, dissipated his ability by writing beautifully wonderful comedies, well, the jokes on the people who accuse him of dissipation, the fabulous pieces. So, The Marriage of Figaro, for sure, one of the great comedies. Next, we come to Rossini, who was an amazing comic opera writer, and he was also a very good serious opera writer. He's not given credit for doing the serious stuff. He's usually given credit for being a comedian. And for that reason, he's ranked lower than he deserves to be, because he was a genius. And the one I chose was La Cenerentola, not the Barber of Seville, Cinderella. And the reason I chose Cinderella is because, first of all, it's a fairy tale. We all know the story. But it's a fairy tale where the supernatural element has been completely removed, mostly. And instead, what we get are really fabulous characters. Cinderella is of course, a serious character. The prince and his buffo companion, Dandini, are rather humorous. And Cinderella's, stepfather or father, it's not a stepfather, but her wicked stepsisters, whatever they are, they're hilarious. I mean, they are really funny characters and deliciously drawn by Rossini. And that gives the whole thing, it's a fairy tale, but he humanizes the whole thing so beautifully. And he humanizes it with the language of comedy by making these very fallible, human, vain, annoying characters come to life. It's an incredible piece, an absolutely incredible piece, and it ends with one of Rossini's greatest arias. Non più mesta. The rondo for La Cenerentola when she is triumphant at the very end, and it's just glorious. So there you go. Next, Donizetti, Don Pasquale. Now, everybody sort of thinks that that's lightweight, and it is lightweight. It's frothy and funny. It's a taming of the shrew story, although the shrew doesn't get tamed. The shrew tames the tamer in that particular tale. But the fun thing about Don Pasquale is that it was the first comic opera, the first opera buffo that was through composed, in Italy anyway, that was completely through composed. It didn't have recitatives separated by arias, which was a major thing, to create that sort of continuity the necessary continuity to create comedy as continuous music, rather than comedy as funny situations and then you stop and sing an aria. And sometimes the aria was funny, but not always. But in Don Pasquale, you've got a continuous framework of amusement, and a delicious work it is. I saw it when I was in college. It's not done as much as it used to be. It really isn't. I saw it when I was in Baltimore. The Baltimore Civic Opera did it. Very good production, by the way. And it was just delightful. It was such a refreshing evening out. You came away feeling better, more awake than when you went in. And it has such great tunes, you know. That's you know, whatever her name is. I don't even know the names. Rosina or Blanchina or, you know, Proserpina. I don't know. She's the one who's going to tame Don Pasquale. And they did it in English. And the English translation, of course, was just that made it more funny. So the aria was, I know the things a glance can do and when to do the glancing. You know, and then ended with the tender surrender that every girl desired. Oh my gosh, it was embarrassing. But the whole piece was lovely and very, very amusing. Next, Offenbach. Offenbach, who is one of the great geniuses of the 19th century. But of course, he wrote comedies. People would rather watch the Tales of Hoffmann, because in whatever hundreds of versions that you do it, because it's not as funny as his operettas, but his operettas are hilarious. Absolutely hilarious. So the one I chose was La Grande-Duchesse de Gérolstein, the Grand Duchess of Gérolstein. She's a spoiled brat, and she's trying to, well, she just causes commotion everywhere she goes, trying to mate up with with the boyfriend who loves her, but who she does not love. And this operetta has one of the best lines in all of opera. It really does. I mean, you know, again, all the good lines are in comedies, never in tragedies. Tragedies are just, I love you, I'm dying, you know, torture me, I'm suffering. I mean, you know, we've heard it all before. But comedies are smart. And the line in this comedy is, if one can't have what one loves, one must learn to love what one can have. Yes! That is the word of wisdom, and it is La Grande-Duchesse who gets educated to that little homonym or homily, or what, not homonym, homily, whatever it's called, that little epigrammatic statement, which is what the whole thing is about. And it's just delicious, with wonderful music and fun characterizations and great situations. And you know, there's General Boom, you know, people like that, or Woof, and, you know, so it's great. So after Offenbach, who we really ought to explore, I mean, if I had time, you know, this is the problem with this musical business I'm doing, right? I've already done, you know, at this point, around 1,500 videos, and I would like to just do all of Offenbach and all of Gilbert and Sullivan. Yes, they're next. The problem is I can't get rights to play samples. And if you can't play samples, it's almost impossible to talk about these things. It really is. I mean, when I did a talk about Sullivan, actually today as well, at least I had, you know, the Naxos Overture disc. I could play samples. And I could do samples from Offenbach, too, the same way. But it's hard, because these labels aren't cooperating. They don't want me to help them sell their stuff. Those idiots, they also have no sense of humor. So anyway, Sullivan's The Mikado. Oh my God, what a masterpiece. Every single number is a jewel, and the whole story is hilarious. And it's such a great spoof of all of that Asian Oriental stuff that was taking over music in the 19th century. And the characters are unbelievable. I mean, it even makes fun of Darwin. You know, there's that one character who's, you know, the poor nobleman who traces his who is so exalted he traces his ancestry, that's the word, back to a primal protoplasmic atomic globule. You will never hear a more perfect marriage of unbelievably great words with unbelievably great music than you do in Gilbert and Sullivan. It's a perfect union. And there's like a dozen of these suckers. And nobody thinks that because of that, as I said in the other talk, that Sullivan was England's greatest composer. Well, he was. And, he wrote the most perfect works in a medium, let's face it, comic opera, where greatness was not usually considered something to aim for, or that didn't happen as often, or that everybody was peeing on because they considered it a lower form of art. It was lower because it was funny. It was lower because it was theatrical. It was lower because it didn't have a moral. I mean, all of those stupid things that these people insisted that music do, instead of just be great, just be its best self. Well, in Gilbert and Sullivan's The Mikado, music is its best self. And the thing is just brilliant. It's the work of total genius. So there. Next, Smetana's The Barter Bride. Fabulous. It's so wonderful that, the highest production, theatrical production of a culture could be a comedy. That the Czech nation could be comfortable saying, this is the best of us. And it's a comedy. It's got jolly peasants dancing around, and the story is very funny and very cute and charming, and the music is absolutely fabulous. Smetana never wrote a better work. We accept it with Smetana. We accept it with Czechoslovakia because people don't take the Czechs all that seriously, because they are a minor European culture. They are not the French. They are not the Germans. They are not the Italians. They are, you see how there's a political element in this, and a cultural element, and an element of really insulting snobbery and elitism that has nothing to do with music. Nothing at all. Nothing at all. But we allow the Barter Bride to be the great Czech lyric drama because the Czechs are supposed to be jolly peasants who like that sort of thing. They don't get tragedy. See? For Germany, you've got Tristan and Isolde. Oh, you've got Fidelio. You've got Der Freischütz. You've got The Ring. You've got, all these grandiose statements of high philosophical purpose. Everything except what really matters to people, which is love, companionship, family, marital felicity. I mean, I'd rather have that any day. I really would. And you'll notice when I have these pieces that Die Meistersinger is not in this list. Because although it is a comedy, technically, I don't think it's funny. I don't think Wagner had the slightest ability to be funny. I think he was far too self-absorbed and far too concerned with his own megalomania to take a moment to just allow humor, natural humor, to arise. He had to be mean. He had to torture the people he didn't like Beckmesser. It had to be so disagreeable. Now, don't get me wrong. Die Meistersinger is great music. It's gorgeous music. I love it. I've talked about it. I like just playing it and listening to it, completely away from the stage. It flows beautifully. It's a miracle of composition. But comedy? Nah, I don't think so. I think Parsifal is much funnier. Anyway, so that's Smetana's The Bartered Bride. Next, Verdi's Falstaff, of course. A total masterpiece, and one of the most heartwarming, humane works in the entire repertoire. Because here you have a guy who spent his entire career, other than his second opera, Un Giorno di Regno, or whatever it was. That was a comedy. After that, Verdi stopped writing comedies for his entire career until the end. But he wanted to go out with a laugh. I think that's extraordinary. The guy was in his 80s. He could finally let his hair down and do something. He wrote it for himself. He wrote it for posterity, in a sense, just so that he could have the last word and do it in a way which is humorous. And Falstaff is a deliciously funny opera, and it's a very difficult piece to perform, because it's an ensemble work. It doesn't have really, I mean, Falstaff, of course, is a major role, and he gets a couple monologues and whatnot, but essentially it's an ensemble piece, and it requires incredible lightness and dexterity and witty interplay back and forth in order for it to work. It's absolutely phenomenal. And it tells us something also about one of the reasons why comic opera tends not to be valued as much as tragedy, because tragedy, you get to soliloquize. You know, you've got the big tragic aria, the big tragic ensemble. In comedy, you have to have just ensemble. It's about how wonderful the cast is and how well they work together. And Falstaff is the locus classicus for that type of piece. Next, here's one you probably don't know too well. Dvořák, The Devil and Kate, also known as Kate and the Devil, depending on how you do it. I think in Czech it's like Čert a Katja. Now, The Devil and Kate doesn't get any love because, first of all, Dvořák doesn't get any love as an opera composer anyway, aside from Rusalka, but he wrote at least half a dozen really great operas. And second of all, it's a comedy, and it's funny. And there's nothing like it. It's a funny fairy tale about a rather pushy, boisterous, Zoftig in some productions girl who isn't getting any dance time, and she's very annoyed, and everybody is like terrified of her because she's such a bossy pest, and she just wants to find a guy to dance with her and get married, you know, and it's not going very well. But at some point, this bumbling devil named Marubel shows up. He's supposed to suck the princess down to hell, the evil princess who's been abusing all the peasants. And he's very, very clumsy. And so he grabs Kate instead. And he sucks her down to hell. It's a funny, funny scene. And Act 2 takes place in hell. And Kate makes life miserable for everybody. Everybody, including Satan, who's really a very funny character. And so she comes back up, and finally the princess shows up, and Maribel's supposed to grab her. And they there's a plot, and they reform the princess. They convince the princess that if she's nice to everybody and shares her wealth and behaves properly, then they will save her from the devil, because she knows the devil is coming to get her at that point, and she's very fearful and regretful. And how do they scare the devil away? Well, it turns out that all the jewels and stuff that the devil gave Kate to suck her down into hell all turned to trash as soon as she came back up, and she's very, very annoyed. So they hide her in the closet, and when the devil comes, very frighteningly, the music's fabulous, to take the princess, out comes Kate to give him a piece of her mind, and the devil runs away in absolute terror, and Kate gets her house, and presumably at some point a husband, and she gets money, and everyone's happy, and they all do a lot of peasant dancing. It's very, very funny, and the music is gorgeous. It's every bit as rich musically and melodically, abundant as Rusalka. It's just funny, and no one's ever going to do anything about it. Oh my goodness! It has some of Dvořák's most fabulous orchestration. When the devil describes the fabulous realm he wants to take Kate to, you've got a contrabass clarinet and two tubas, and harps and tam-tams going. And oh my goodness, it's an extraordinary work. There's only one recording of it on Supraphon. Fortunately, it's a very good one. But how can we live without this music? This brilliant, funny, delightful, warm, humane, delicious music. Well, we try. It's terrible. So then, Janáček. We're in the Czechs, right? We're going to do the Czechs. Janáček, the Excursions of Mr Brouček. Nobody does this one either. I mean, everyone acknowledges Janáček as one of the great opera composers of the 20th century. And his tragic ones, I mean, Yennefer and the Macropolis Case, and From the House of the Dead, and Copacabana, and even The Cunning Little Vixen, which is really a comedy for most of its time. It's based on a comic strip, after all. Yes, the main character does get shot and made into a muff. That's true. But it's also the only opera where the main character gets to defecate on another character in order to get her burrow. So it has its comic elements. But Mr. Brouček's Excursions, there are two of them. Mr. Bruch is a little bumbling Czech merchant guy who gets sloshed and, keeps sausages in his pocket and dreams he's going first to the moon and then to the 15th century, to the, Reformation wars with the Hussites and whatnot. And again, it's a very quirky piece. Granted, it is. And there have only been 2 recordings of it, but fortunately there's a great one on Deutsche Grammophon with Jerzy Bieloglavek conducting, and it's musically stunning. It's such a beautiful piece. Oh my goodness. And it's funny. It is legitimately funny. Its quirkiness is part of the humor, of course. And the music is glorious, absolutely glorious. And people have said that, this opera doesn't travel. It's not going to travel. It's bullshit. It doesn't travel because people don't travel with it. If you traveled with it, if you gave it a sympathetic production and had people understand what all the screaming is about, they would think it's funny, because it is funny, and it's vintage Janáček. He wrote it at the same time as Taras Bulba. It's mature Janáček, and it's absolutely marvelous. It comes before the last 4 operas, which are, of course, a lot more, shall we say, emotionally gut-wrenching. Yes. Well, you don't always need to have your guts wrenched. Sometimes your guts are fine. You can just leave them where they are and have them just vibrate with humor instead of having them torn to bits. It's just a phenomenal piece. So the Excursions of Mr. Bruch is on the list. Next, Kurt Weill, The Rise and Fall of the City of Mahagoni. One of the great early 20th century operas. Unquestionably, it's a very bitter, very sarcastic, very ironic piece. This is bitter comedy. It's, of course, left-wing anti-capitalist commentary, but I have to say, it doesn't lay it on so thick that the ideological nonsense gets in the way of the unbelievably insane situations that go on in this opera. I mean, there's no point even trying to describe what happens in it. It's complete anarchy, and wonderfully so. And it's got great numbers. It's got the Alabama song, Oh, Moon of Alabama. I mean, it's in English. A couple of the songs are in English anyway, very strange English. Bertolt Brecht's version of strange English. But the music is marvelous. Kurt Weill was a dramatic genius. His operas and theatrical works are still very little understood and terribly underrated, but they are musically as rich as anything anybody at the time was doing. And if you actually, had the opportunity to, now there's a critical edition coming out, but if their critical edition was accompanied by a really serious collection of recordings, there's some of them are on Capriccio. There's a Weill edition. So here's some of that stuff. You would have a legacy which is as great as Benjamin Britten's or any of the major 20th century theatrical geniuses. And The Rise and Fall of the City of Mahagoni is his operatic masterpiece, quite possibly. And it is quite comedic. So there you go. And after that, there's 3 more. Can you believe it? Aren't we having fun? Poulenc, Les Mamelles de Tiresias. Oh, this was such a failure when it was first performed. It's an opera bouffe about Tiresias, a woman who has had enough with the place of womanhood in her culture, and so she lets her breasts go. They're 2 inflatable hydrogen balloons, or helium balloons, and they float upward, and she becomes a man while her husband has 20,000 children, and it actually talks about Connecticut, because Poulenc was in love with the word Connecticut, as they say in France. You promised me when we were together in Connecticut, she says. But it's insane. It's an absurdist piece. 1 act. It lasts about an hour, and the music is hysterically funny. And when it was first performed, the moral of it was have more children, you who have so few. It was a post-war tract trying to encourage the French people after the depredations of the war to replenish the earth, given the horrible casualties that the country had suffered. And nobody was in a mood to laugh. Nobody. And I don't blame him. I really don't. But there's no reason not to adore the work itself, because it's Poulenc at his absolute insouciant best. And after Poulenc, we have to talk about Richard Strauss. Richard Strauss is in some ways, in my view, one of the most tragic cases in all of 20th century music. Why? Because he really only wanted to write comic operas. He wanted to be the next Mozart. That was his goal. I mean, he got everyone's attention with Salome and Electra, right? And we grant him Der Rosenkavalier as a comedy because, well, it is funny, but everyone says that the funny part, which is like Act 3, is not as good as the rest of it, which is sentimental. You know, it has that sugary, sweet, sentimental Viennese quality that everybody loves. And it is a wonderful, wonderful work. But my goodness, after that, he did nothing but comedies, primarily, at least nothing but comedies. And they were all failures in one way or another. I mean, Die Frau und Schatten is a comedy. It's probably his greatest work. It's not the one I chose for this list, though. The one I chose for this list is Die Schweigsame Frau, Ben Jonson's The Silent Woman. A wonderfully funny story. It's a classic comedy of a play. Strauss said it fantastically. He really did. It's possibly his strongest late work, and it's completely disregarded, totally ignored. It's full of great music. It has wonderful characters. It's the classic story of, it's Don Pasquale. I mean, it's, you know, the rich miser who wants to marry the young girl, and, you know, and she's in love with somebody else, and he's going to disinherit everybody. And you know the story. It's that classic story. Part of the problem with Strauss's comedies is some of them do get, you know, because he's German, I guess, they do get a little bit mean. They really are. They get, you know, the humor is sometimes nasty, and it's always about money. It really is kind of fascinating if you look at these people. One of the things that always kind of amazed me is the horrible prejudice against, you know, the Jews of Germany, particularly as being like moneylenders and greedy and all this stuff. But look at the plots of Strauss's operas. They're all about miserable bourgeois people who are grasping after money. And there's this, it does have this sort of, you know, I don't know if it's a middle class critique, but there is this, and Strauss himself was that way. There's just this obsession over the cost of everything, and having to have more money and more status and more, you know, it was such an awful society. I mean, no wonder they like blamed the Jews for all their misery and all their awfulness. It really is kind of like scary when you look at those stories and what they sort of represent about what the ideals and moral standards were of the day. But that's just a digression. I mean, ignore me. It is a fabulous opera, Die Schweigsame Frau, and it's the one where, yeah, it's all about rich guy and money and all that stuff, but it's not taken to like craziness like Arabella, which is horrible. I mean, her parents are just awful. All they care about is basically selling her to get more money. I mean, things like that. It's really, really bad. And Die Liebe der Dane is like that too a little bit. You know, showers of gold. It's all you have is showers of gold. You know, I'm not going to change that one around because showers of gold can quite easily become something rather scatological, can't it? Anyway, the point we're talking about is Die Schweigsame Frau, a great opera by Strauss, and you know, it's essential to understanding what he wanted to do as a composer, what he was trying to do as a composer, which was find another great comic opera libretto, especially after Hofmannsthal died. And that was as close as he got. And it really deserves a lot more attention. I mean, I think Capriccio is very good. Intermezzo is very funny. Intermezzo is a wonderful opera, too. There are a few real gems in Strauss's late output, and they ought not to be completely dismissed because they're funny. But being funny in the German context is really tough. I mean, it was really tough. He was fighting an uphill battle. He really was. And it wasn't one that he was ever going to win. And, okay, so let them say he didn't win. We don't have to. I don't have to. You don't have to. Give Die Schweigsame Frau a shot. Give it a shot. It's a wonderful piece. Finally, last but certainly not least, Tippett's The Midsummer Marriage, which is an astonishing masterpiece. It really is. It's the Magic Flute updated. basically. That's what it is. It's that kind of a comedy. It's a very serious comedy. It's a comedy about, personal fulfillment and transfiguration and well, that's what the magic flute is about, right? Ascending to higher planes of knowledge and wisdom, and it's nothing makes any sense, and the plot is completely zany, but the music is wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. It's fabulous. It's early Tippett at his lyrical best. It's ecstatic, and it's difficult, and it's a little bit risque, and it has its bumpy moments, but goodness gracious. I mean, when I went and saw that, when they did it in San Francisco, when I was a grad student at Stanford, wow, what an unbelievable impression it made. And they did a very good production, too, at City Opera, although they made a bunch of cuts, to trim it down a little bit. It's a wonderful reimagining of the characters and the situations in the Magic Flute, and it has that wonderful mix of humor and seriousness, because funny is funny, but why do we laugh? We laugh, someone described it as an interrupted defense mechanism. We laugh because we are feeling something. We are feeling something, and we feel what we feel is a desire not to be in the situation these people are in. And the crazier they are, the more we laugh, because the more fearful we are that it could be us. I mean, there's something of that. And I think the Midsummer Marriage really kind of ties into that in a way. But it's a brilliant piece, an absolutely brilliant piece. And there's only been one great recording of it, the Colin Davis, which is now on Lyrita, with Covent Garden. It was originally on Philips, and they don't care, but fortunately it has survived, and it is a glorious, wonderful piece of music in the classic comic opera style. That is, the impediments to a marriage. That's the basic comic opera plot of all of these things, one way or another, or many of them. It's about people who want to get married, and they have barriers that they have to overcome, and some of those barriers are very silly, and some of the situations are very silly, but that's the essence of comedy. It's about human relationships, and that's, of course, what the Midsummer Marriage is about, in a kind of crazy Jungian sense. But it's a great piece, and it's a comedy, and those, my friends, are the 16 great, irreplaceable, irrepressible comic operas. Now, I know some of you will have others, because, like I said, I limited myself to one per composer, and there are some composers who were not mentioned, and some whom I mentioned and disregarded. So you can contest that all you want, but make sure it's comic. Keep it funny, friends, and keep on listening. Thank you for joining me. Take care.